Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you choose to look at these videos. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Glad to be looking today at Psalm 109 with you. Just really an interesting psalm, and one of those psalms that make us uncomfortable because it's really calling down judgment on adversaries, invoking God's vengeance upon them. Sometimes the psalm and psalms like it are singled out and uh, for contradicting or apparently contradicting Jesus' teaching. Of course, Jesus from the cross said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Here, this psalm is asking for judgment and vengeance. How do you resolve those things? It's got a lot of very clear imprecatory or statements that call God's wrath down upon his enemies. Also, you need to keep in mind that this is a prophetic psalm. It's messianic in its content. This was the view in the early church. Men like Chrysostom and Jerome and Augustine and others saw this as predictive of prophetic of Jesus' suffering and his return. I came across a good quote. I'll just read it to you here. I'm going to take a little time on this psalm. It says the psalm can then fit the experiences of the life and passion of Jesus, which changes its tenor completely, in a large measure removes it from being imprecatory, that is, a call for vengeance, and makes it predictive. So I think that idea that this is a psalm about Jesus predicting his messianic suffering as well as his messianic triumph helps us understand it. But I think it also has applicable to us today too. So we'll talk about that as we go through this. Let me just summarize this a bit. Verses 1 through 5 are really a plea for help. And what you see here is David calling for vengeance upon his enemies. They spoken and acted deceitfully against him, and specifically without cause. Look at verse 5. They have repaid me evil for good and hatred for my love. Have you ever felt that way? I bet you have, and you can identify with the feelings of the psalmist here. In verses 6 to 20, part of this is a prayer for righteous reckoning. He asks for punishment on his enemies. He's including appointing wicked men over them and making their days few and bringing judgment upon them. You know, one of the ways that God brings judgment on guilty people is to bring them bad leaders. And we see that in verse 6 here. Appoint a wicked man over him, that is, over those who have exchanged his love or repaid his love but with hatred, and let an accuser stand at his right hand. So he's asking for God to bring terrible leaders to lead them. In verse 21, he calls on God to deal kindly with him, deliver him from affliction. He's responding, as we often see, on God's loving kindness. Verses 22 through 29, as we go through the psalm, we see that he acknowledges his weakness and his suffering and his vulnerability, what he's talking about here, and but he remains hopeful in God's help. And the psalm concludes with David then praising the Lord, expressing confidence that God is in fact going to protect him, that God will in fact bring justice to those who wronged him. So just in terms of outline to help you through this is it's a plea for divine help, as we must all sometimes plea when we are wronged, a prayer for God's righteous reckoning on the wrongdoer. Curses, I think, are contrasted here with the forgiveness of Christ. and then confidence in divine defense, 21 through 31. So our here verse is in verse 21, but you, O Lord, but you, O God, the Lord, deal kindly with me for your name's sake, because your loving kindness is good. Deliver me. I love this opening here, but you, O God, the Lord. David is really, this is God, an expression of, I think, fear of God. David's reverence and his approach to God. O God, the Lord. This is David being very deferential. O God is translating the word Yahweh. Lord is translating the word Adonai. And he is being very deferential. He's asking for God to deal kindly with him for your name's sake. I think that's so interesting. David's not imploring God to act because David is so good, because David knows he's not. He's not asking God to act because David is so deserving, because David knows he's not. What he's asking God to do is deal with his enemies, deal kindly with David for your name's sake. David is recognizing he is a sinner, besieged by opposition and betrayal. He is God's man. God has called him his servant back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And God has, he is asking God to act on behalf of his servant, to protect his servant as we would protect a coworker. I heard a story yesterday about a man who owned a business, and he was at work, and an irate husband came into the office threatening his wife, and he reacted, protecting his employee. Well, same thing with God here. David is asking God to protect him. I'm your servant. I'm doing what you've asked me to do. Protect me while I'm doing it. He appeals to God's loving kindness. This is frequent, and it says again, by now you know it's God's loyal love, his loyal commitment to his people. He's asking him to act on that and deliver David for relief from his enemies, deliver him ultimately from his enemies. So that's the explanation of that highlighted verse. How do we apply that? Well, I think, again, my experience in the Bible is the more I study something, the more obvious the applications become. And I know from personal experience that many of you also are experiencing opposition and betrayal right now in your lives. Like Jesus, this may be coming from someone you thought to be a close friend. Jesus received his opposition and ultimately betrayal from Judas, a close friend. Perhaps in your case, it's a family member. Perhaps in your case, it's someone even in your church. Well, I pray that this psalm would remind you that even Jesus suffered the same thing, that you are joining with him in the fellowship of his suffering. Notice here, verse 8, the second cola. This might sound so familiar to you. You'll see it in Acts chapter 1, verse 20, where Peter is providing this as a basis for the reason they need to replace Judas, who had betrayed Jesus. Let another take his office. So, while you may have a kind of an urge, knee-jerk reaction to defend yourself and perhaps bring vengeance upon your enemies yourself, remember, as Jesus did, that God is the ultimate defender, that God says that vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And if we ask for it, I think we'll find strength to endure the opposition and even betrayal that you may be experiencing now. find strength to endure it and wait for God to take his vengeance, because he loves you, he cares for you. If someone does something evil to you, he knows they're doing something evil to him as well. So be patient in your suffering. Resolve now to leave vengeance in God's hands. God bless you.